There comes a moment, sometimes subtle, sometimes glaring, when you realize something once sacred is no longer being protected. In recent weeks, that moment has come again and again, as we've watched members of the United States Congress move through hearings, votes, and public statements, with a noticeable absence of something once assumed, a commitment to defend the Constitution of the United States. Not a commitment to a party, not to a political figure, but to the document they swore an oath to uphold. And what we're seeing now isn't just political theater. It's a psychological event, a human phenomenon, a moment where self-preservation has overtaken responsibility.
Hello and welcome to the Psychology of Us with Professor RJ Starr, where we explore the mind's influence on life, relationships, and society. RJ Starr is an existential psychologist, professor, and author dedicated to exploring the core challenges of human existence, how we find meaning, embrace responsibility, and navigate life's challenges. Known for a thought-provoking yet accessible approach, RJ inspires listeners to cultivate self-awareness, emotional intelligence, authenticity, and purpose. This podcast is designed for all psychology enthusiasts, practitioners, students, and anyone curious about why we think, feel, and behave the way we do. Each episode unpacks theories, explores complex questions, and offers insights that deepen understanding of the human experience. So settle in, stay curious, and discover the psychology of us.
Now let me be clear, I'm not talking about a few bad actors, or about corruption in the most obvious sense. I'm talking about the quiet turning away, the moral shrug, the shifting of eyes to the floor when truth becomes inconvenient, or when speaking up might cost someone their committee seat, their re-election, their safety, their standing. It's easy to call it cowardice, it's tempting to call it betrayal, and maybe it is. But as a psychologist, I see something more complicated, something that actually shows up in all of us, in different forms, every single day. I see self-preservation. When the risk of standing up feels greater than the cost of staying quiet, people retreat, and sometimes that retreat comes dressed in silence, or avoidance, or passive agreement with something they know in their bones is wrong. That's what I want to talk about today, because what we're witnessing in Congress is not isolated. It's reflective. It's a mirror, one that shows us how the instinct to survive, to protect ourselves from discomfort or danger or disruption, can often override the deeper voice of integrity. This happens in institutions. It happens in relationships. It happens in us. And if we don't understand the psychology of self-preservation, we risk blaming everything on them, without ever looking at what it means to preserve ourselves, at the cost of what really matters. So today we're going to explore what self-preservation really is. Not just biologically, but psychologically. We're going to talk about when it protects us, when it betrays us, and why it's so tempting to shrink back when the world demands we show up. Because if we want to live in a society that still values courage, we need to understand why fear often wins. So, what is self-preservation? Self-preservation is one of the oldest instincts we have. At its core, it is the drive to stay alive, to avoid danger, to shield the body, to protect the self. It's baked into our biology. When the brain detects threat, it doesn't wait for a rational analysis. It acts. The amygdala floods us with signals. Cortisol rises. Muscles tense. And before we've even had a chance to form a thought, the body has made a decision. Fight, flee, freeze, or fawn. You've heard of the first three: fight the threat, flee from it, or freeze, play dead, hope the danger passes. But that fourth response, fawn, is less talked about, and yet deeply relevant to how we survive not just physical threat, but social and emotional ones. To fawn means to appease, to become agreeable, compliant, pleasing, even when something inside of you is screaming. It is a form of self-preservation that doesn't look like resistance at all. In fact, it often looks like politeness, or professionalism, or peacemaking, but at its root, it's still fear. It's still about keeping oneself safe in a world that feels unpredictable or unsafe. When someone stays quiet as something unethical unfolds, when they go along with a narrative they know isn't true, when they support something they privately oppose, what we're often seeing is not agreement, it's fawning. Appeasement, survival. And this is where we begin to understand that self-preservation, while protective in its original design, has a shadow side. Let's widen the lens for a moment. Abraham Maslow, whose hierarchy of needs is one of the most foundational psychological models, placed safety just above physiological survival. Before we can think about love, esteem, or self-actualization, we have to feel safe. Safe in our bodies. Safe in our environments. Safe in our belonging. If we don't, We retreat. Psychologically, emotionally, socially. That retreat can take many forms. Sometimes it's denial. We pretend the problem isn't there. Sometimes it's detachment. We numb ourselves and stop caring. Sometimes it's dissociation. We split off from the part of ourselves that knows something is wrong. And sometimes it's complicity. We nod. We smile. We vote yes. Anna Freud, one of the key figures in the development of ego defense theory, taught that defense mechanisms aren't failures of the psyche. They are tools, adaptive, useful tools. But when those tools are used habitually, unconsciously, and in the face of moral crisis, they can cause real harm. Not just to others, but to the self. Because every time we retreat from what we know is true, something inside of us takes the hit. Our clarity dulls, our courage thins, and eventually, we lose track of what we really believe. This is how institutions decay, but it's also how individuals become unrecognizable to themselves. Let me pause here and say something important. Self-preservation is not weakness. It is not inherently wrong. Sometimes silence is safety. Sometimes stepping back is the only option we have. This is especially true for people who have experienced trauma, or those who are chronically marginalized or threatened. Self-preservation is a right, but what I'm inviting us to think about today is not the right to preserve the self, but the cost of preserving the self at the expense of the truth. When do we cross the line between protecting ourselves and abandoning our integrity? That's the question. And it's one that deserves more than a quick answer, because in the next segment, we're going to explore how this dynamic plays out, not just in the halls of government, but in our daily lives, in the roles we play, in the things we don't say, and in the ways we all, at one point or another, have chosen the safety of silence over the risk of truth. Now let's take a look at political parallels. When leaders retreat, by turning to the public stage, to the House floor, to the Senate chamber, the press conferences, the backdoor meetings. Because when we talk about self-preservation, we're not just talking about fear of physical danger. We're talking about fear of humiliation, fear of political suicide, fear of being exiled by one's own party or permanently labeled as disloyal. And so, we watch a strange thing happen. We see leaders retreat in plain sight. One of the most powerful examples of this dynamic comes from what psychologist Irving Janis called groupthink. It's a concept that emerged from studying disastrous decisions made by political leaders, not because they lacked intelligence, but because they succumbed to an environment where dissent was discouraged and cohesion became more important than truth. Groupthink thrives in high-pressure situations where loyalty to the group takes precedence over individual judgment. When leaders are surrounded by colleagues who value harmony over honesty, they begin to silence their own doubts. They become deferential, they second-guess themselves, and eventually they conform, not because they believe the narrative, but because it feels too dangerous not to. You can see this in how some lawmakers vote against their stated principles, in how they explain away contradictions they once condemned, or how they go eerily quiet after previously voicing concern. It's not that their convictions disappeared overnight, it's that fear, subtle, corrosive, systemic, did what it always does. It whispered, stay silent and survive. There's a specific psychological term for this, pluralistic ignorance. It happens when a group of people privately reject a belief or behavior, but go along with it anyway, because they think everyone else agrees. The result? A room full of people pretending. A chamber of government, where nearly everyone knows something is wrong, but no one feels safe enough to say it. You can imagine how dangerous that is in politics, but you've probably experienced it in your own life. Think about being in a meeting where something unethical was suggested, but no one challenged it, or at a family gathering where someone made a cruel joke and everyone nervously laughed. That moment, that choice not to speak, is the same psychological mechanism. The only difference is scale. We must also talk about Stanford's Philip Zimbardo, who showed through his prison experiment just how quickly ordinary people conform to roles, especially when authority goes unchecked. In the absence of accountability, and under the illusion of group consensus, people will often override their internal compass, not because they're evil, but because they've stopped trusting that the system will protect them if they stand alone. In this light, what we're witnessing in Congress isn't just legislative stagnation, it's a collapse of psychological courage. It's self-preservation institutionalized, a system where doing the right thing can end your career, while going along with the wrong thing might advance it. And that kind of environment doesn't just erode public trust, it erodes the moral foundation of leadership itself. But here's the deeper truth. Leaders are not exempt from human psychology. They are immersed in it, just like the rest of us. their retreat isn't a mystery, it's predictable. Because when survival becomes the priority, integrity becomes negotiable. And this is why we can't just analyze political failure through the lens of policy or procedure. We have to understand the psyche that produces those decisions, the emotional and social undercurrents that pull people away from responsibility and into silence. But it doesn't stop in government. In fact, this instinct to retreat, to protect ourselves from conflict, discomfort, or exposure, plays out in far more familiar places: relationships, friendships, marriages, workplaces, even casual interactions. It's important to recognize that the instinct for self-preservation transcends political affiliations. For instance, former Republican Congressman Adam Kinzinger faced significant backlash, including death threats, after taking a stand against his party's mainstream narrative. His experience underscores how individuals across the political spectrum can encounter immense pressure to conform, highlighting the universal nature of these psychological dynamics. So next, we're going to look inward. We'll explore how self-preservation shows up in your life and mine, how we avoid, how we appease, and how we sometimes betray our own values to maintain peace, or at least the illusion of it. Because when you recognize the pattern in yourself, you begin to understand how it takes root in the world. So now let's bring this closer to home. It's easy to point to Congress and see self-preservation at work. But the truth is, this instinct lives in all of us. It shows up in our relationships, our workplaces, our communities, and often it operates so quietly that we don't even notice it. Think about a time when you stayed silent during a meeting, even though you disagreed with what was being said. Or when you laughed at a joke that made you uncomfortable, just to avoid standing out. Maybe you've avoided giving someone honest feedback because you didn't want to risk the discomfort it might cause. These moments might seem small, but they're significant. They're instances where we choose safety over authenticity, where we prioritize harmony over honesty, and while that might protect us in the short term, over time, it can erode our sense of self. Psychologically, this is tied to our need for belonging. According to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, after our basic physiological and safety needs are met, we seek love and belonging. This drive can be so strong that we're willing to suppress our own truths to maintain our place in a group. But there's a cost. Each time we silence ourselves, we reinforce the idea that our voice doesn't matter. We begin to doubt our perceptions, question our judgments, and slowly, we lose touch with our own values. This isn't just about individual well-being. When everyone in a group is engaging in this kind of self-preservation, it creates an environment where truth is obscured and accountability is diminished. It's the same dynamic we see on larger scales, like in political institutions. So, what can we do? It starts with awareness. Recognizing when we're choosing comfort over courage. Asking ourselves, what am I avoiding? What am I afraid of? And then, taking small steps to speak up, to be honest, to align our actions with our values. It's not about being confrontational or reckless. It's about being authentic. And in doing so, we not only reclaim our own integrity, but also contribute to a culture where truth is valued, and self-preservation doesn't come at the cost of our collective well-being. To deepen our understanding, let's consider some reflective questions. What are my core values, and how do they guide my actions? Have I ever remained silent to avoid conflict, even when I felt compelled to speak? What fears hold me back from expressing my true beliefs? Engaging with these questions can illuminate areas where self-preservation may be influencing our choices, allowing us to navigate our lives with greater authenticity. Let's talk about the cost of constant preservation. Because while self-preservation can be a necessary response to immediate danger, living in a constant state of preservation, always on guard, always avoiding discomfort, comes at a significant price. Psychologically, chronic self-preservation can lead to heightened anxiety, depression, and stress-related disorders. When we consistently suppress our emotions and needs to maintain a facade of peace, we may experience emotional distress and anxiety. Physically, the toll is just as severe. Research indicates that self-silencing behaviors, particularly among women, are linked to increased risks of heart disease, autoimmune disorders, and even premature death. This constant state of self-preservation doesn't just affect our health, it impacts our relationships and our sense of self. When we habitually avoid conflict or suppress our true feelings, we create distance between ourselves and others. Over time, we may lose touch with our own values and desires, leading to a diminished sense of identity. Moreover, this pattern can perpetuate a cycle of avoidance and fear. The more we retreat from discomfort, the more daunting it becomes to face it. This can result in a life constrained by fear, where opportunities for growth and connection are missed. But perhaps the most insidious cost is the erosion of authenticity. When we prioritize safety over truth, we compromise our integrity. We become actors in our own lives, performing roles that don't reflect our true selves. So, what can we do? It starts with awareness. Recognizing when we're choosing self-preservation over authenticity is the first step. From there, we can begin to challenge these patterns, speaking up when it's uncomfortable, setting boundaries, and allowing ourselves to be seen. It's not easy. It requires courage and vulnerability, but the reward is a life lived with integrity, connection, and true resilience. So here's a question. What does courage look like? Because if self-preservation is the instinct to retreat, then courage is the decision to stay. Not to stay in harm's way, but to stay present with discomfort. To remain aligned with our values, even when fear urges us to hide. Courage isn't always loud. Often, it's quiet and deliberate. It's the choice to speak up in a meeting when silence feels safer. It's the decision to set a boundary in a relationship, knowing it might lead to conflict. It's the act of being honest with ourselves about what we need, even when it challenges our self-image. Psychologist Brené Brown describes courage as telling the story of who you are with your whole heart. It's about vulnerability, authenticity, and the willingness to be seen. But how do we cultivate this kind of courage? It begins with self-awareness, recognizing the moments when we're tempted to retreat and asking ourselves why. Is it fear of rejection, fear of failure, fear of being misunderstood? Next, we practice self-compassion, understanding that fear is a natural response, and that courage doesn't mean the absence of fear, it means acting in spite of it. We also build resilience by taking small steps outside our comfort zones. Each time we choose authenticity over avoidance, we strengthen our capacity for courage. And finally, we seek connection. Sharing our experiences with others and listening to theirs reminds us that we're not alone. It creates a support system that reinforces our commitment to living authentically. In a world that often rewards conformity and punishes dissent, choosing courage can feel risky. But the cost of constant self-preservation is far greater. It leads to disconnection, dissatisfaction, and a life lived in the shadows. While the context may differ, the internal struggle between self-preservation and moral courage is a shared human experience. Whether it's a public official facing political repercussions or an individual confronting personal fears, the challenge remains. Choosing between the comfort of silence and the risk of authenticity. Recognizing this commonality can foster empathy and understanding across diverse experiences. By embracing courage, we step into the light. We reclaim our voices, our values, and our vitality. So, how do we choose presence over preservation? Well, we began this episode by observing a troubling shift. The United States Congress, an institution sworn to uphold the Constitution, appears increasingly reluctant to defend it. This isn't merely a political issue, it's a psychological one. It's a manifestation of self-preservation overriding responsibility. But this pattern isn't confined to the halls of power. It permeates our personal lives. We too often choose silence over confrontation, comfort over authenticity. We suppress our truths to maintain harmony, fearing the consequences of honesty. Yet, this constant self-preservation comes at a cost. Research indicates that chronic stress and emotional suppression can lead to serious health issues, including anxiety, depression, and cardiovascular disease. For instance, studies have found that self-silencing behaviors are associated with increased risks of heart disease and mortality among women. The antidote is courage, not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. It's the choice to speak up when silence feels safer, to stay present when retreat seems easier. Courage is choosing presence over preservation. As we navigate our lives, let's strive to recognize when we're defaulting to self-preservation and gently challenge ourselves to choose presence instead. In doing so, we not only honor our own integrity but also contribute to a culture that values truth over comfort.
That wraps up this episode of The Psychology of Us with Professor RJ Starr. Each conversation is a step toward greater understanding of ourselves, each other, and the forces that shape human behavior. Listeners are invited to continue the conversation by sharing their thoughts, questions, and topic suggestions at profrjstarr@outlook.com. Every message helps shape future episodes, ensuring the discussions remain relevant, thought-provoking, and meaningful. For those who find value in these explorations, subscribing and leaving a review is a great way to support the podcast
and bring these insights to a wider audience. Until next time, stay curious, stay thoughtful, and keep exploring the psychology of us.